Why did God give the prophetic gift in December of 1844? I suppose we could come up with a number of answers to that question. I have myself settled on about 3 major reasons. This is not in the outline, I'm kind of giving a little prelude. 3 major reasons why I think God gave the prophetic gift, because it was His decision, right? He made that decision. One of them was to encourage those disappointed Adventists that He was still with them. Is that a good reason? To me, maybe that's in some ways one of the larger reasons. I mean, God gives prophecy, the gift of prophecy, sometimes to help strengthen and encourage His people. Isn't that right? And He has down through the ages. So I think that that's one reason. When James White wrote in A Word to the Little Flock that when she shared her vision with the group of Adventists there in Portland, they all accepted it as from God, and they reaffirmed their faith anew in His leading in the Great Advent movement. And so Ellen White's visions from the beginning were linked to validating the great prophetic movement of first half of the 1840s, 1830s. Another reason that I have thought about is what we're going to talk about here. And perhaps this was, again, one of the bigger reasons. 1845 was a time of tumult for Millerite Adventists. So much so that I think that at least up in northern New England, if Ellen Harmon had not been traveling around, sharing and interacting and confronting some of these things, I question what would have happened to the little flock. And do you know what I mean when I say the little flock? How many of you know what I mean when I say the little flock? About a third of you. Adventism reduced until you come to 1846, 1847. And those who are still believers in the 1844 experience and who are beginning to look towards the Sabbath are a very small group of at most 100, maybe a few more, maybe a few less. How many of those would have remained if it had not been for God stepping in and helping to guide them along till they were ready to take that next step? So, dealing with fanaticism was an important purpose of the gift of prophecy. Let's talk about that. I don't want to take longer on this. There actually were a number of different varieties of fanaticism that Ellen White, I'll say Ellen White here, even though we have Ellen Harmon. She was Harmon until 1846, August 1846. But there were a number of different types of fanaticism that Ellen White had to face during 1845. Perhaps the most challenging thing that she faced in her early prophetic ministry was the negative publicity that arose about her in connection with the trial of Israel Damon. How many of you are familiar or have heard of Israel Damon? Really? Is that all? How many? Let me see your hands, because I'm really curious to see. Okay, we've only got maybe half a dozen of you that have heard of this. A few years ago, 2 different scholars independently discovered a transcript of this trial of Israel Damon up in Dover, Maine. It had happened in Atkinson. And it was a newspaper reporter's account of this trial of an Adventist believer, and it includes a number of references to Ellen Harmon, because she was there during the events that led up to his arrest and his trial. She was not at the trial, but her name appears in the press, both up in eastern Maine and down in Massachusetts and in New York State, and as far west as western New York, and even out into Ohio, because they would copy interesting stories, newspapers would. And so it rippled throughout New England and even a little beyond. And it became a very difficult thing for Ellen Harmon, who had always had a good name, and the Harmon family that had a good name. One of the things that precipitated this trial of Israel Damon, and I just want to tell you a bit about it, was the fact that in Maine there was a law against having, or a law that local communities had to pay for the poor and the indigents in their own particular regions. And Adventists, Millerite Adventists, were selling their property. They were being financially irresponsible according to the selectmen of their regions, which led these selectmen, to say, if we don't stop them doing this, they'll be in the poorhouse and we're going to have to financially support it and pay for it. And so they stepped in to try to stop this sort of thing. And in many of the communities, they felt that the influence was more from outside than inside. So whenever an outside person would come in to speak to a group, they considered that to be someone stirring up the problem, and they would try to vigorously address that. In some newspaper accounts that I've read, they were even tarred and feathered, run out of town. Some were beaten. Some were thrown in prison. Israel Damon was arrested, and they took him, and he had a trial. It ended up being somewhat of a test case on religious liberty as well, which has given it some interest to some who are studying the issues of church and state. But the article appeared in the Piscataway Farmer. And so Ellen Harmon was there. Now you have to understand something about Ellen Harmon, Ellen White. She received her first vision in December 1844. How old is she? 17, just 17. Her birthday is in November, so she's just turned 17. And we're talking about a few months later. This is early 1845. So she's just not even halfway between 17 and 18. And she has not very good health. You've probably studied some of this. The doctors had diagnosed her as having tuberculosis, said that she was going to die. She was coughing blood on her first trip up to Poland, Maine, a little before this trip where she meets Israel Damon. She had been unable to speak above a whisper for weeks, and the Lord strengthened her voice to be able to speak. So she's not very well, and yet she's following God's guidance as she understands Him showing her, and she's traveling and sharing her visions. Now on her trip, she's had her midnight cry vision in December 1844, and on her trip in February, she has the Bridegroom Vision, which is where she sees Jesus and the Father go from the holy to the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. So she's had two major visions. And yet, she hasn't thought through all of the fanaticism stuff. And she is, it seems, during these whole proceedings in the home of Thayer, she is sometimes in vision, sometimes not, in the main parlor, usually laying there on the floor in vision. And so there are these descriptions. Now, ironically, at the same time, there is another woman who's at this same Israel Damon event. Her name is Dorinda Baker. And she is also having visions or revelations. But as we look back and we look at Dorinda Baker, Ellen Harmon had a couple of different interactions with her. Ellen White rejects her prophetic gift, her as having an illegitimate gift. So you've got two people here who are having visionary experiences. And so you have a description of these two in the trial transcript. It's an interesting thing to read. If you want to read it, we have it at the center. You can take a look at it. And it turns out that Dorinda Baker is back in the bedroom. And there are men and others going in and out of this bedroom. And so part of the trial's discussion is where Ellen Harmon is. And they pretty much settle that she stays in the parlor in the living room. And that James White doesn't go into the bedroom, although there is some discussion in the trial. So we get some hints at what's going on from this transcript, but not a great deal. And so she's immediately having to confront different things going on here as she's trying to share her visions. Later, Israel Damon and Dorinda Baker end up traveling around together, and I need to tell you that Israel Damon accepts the spiritualizing view. Now, those in my class know what that is, in 1845-46. The spiritualizing view, you had those Adventists who believed that October 22, 1844 was legitimate. They split into two groups, the shut door Adventists. One were what I've called the literalists, or the ones who believed in a literal second coming. They believed in a literal heaven, a literal new earth, but that Jesus was doing something different in heaven. But it was a real heaven. The other group, the Spiritualizers, said that on October 22, 1844, Jesus had actually come and that he was spiritually present, and that we were now in the New Jerusalem, walking in the New Jerusalem, and that the resurrection had taken place and the dead were raised, and so forth and so on. Now, it's a disconnect, right? That's a fanaticism. We'll look at that in a little bit. It's on page 8, point 4. We'll look a little bit more of that. And Israel Damon ends up getting involved in this, and he's traveling promoting it. And so he does become a part of that fanatical component a little bit after he interacts with Ellen Harmon. But I thought you should at least be aware of that struggle that she faced there with Israel Damon. Soon thereafter, Ellen Harmon goes out of state for the first time to share her visions. She goes to New Hampshire and over to Vermont. We think it's probably around May, June, somewhere in there, or in the summer. It's a little uncertain just exactly when, but she goes out of state. Now, there's one other man that she's been interacting with, and you need to know about this man because he's her nemesis. And this man is Joseph Turner. How many of you have heard that name before? Joseph Turner. Again, a few of you, not too many. Joseph Turner had been the editor of the main paper for Millerites, which was called The Hope of Israel. He was also the co-editor or author with Apollos Hale of the Advent Mirror in January of 1845. That promoted the bridegroom idea of explaining the 1844 disappointment. And he was a strong personality. In fact, when Ellen Harmon had her first vision in December of 1844, she was afraid to share it publicly because she thought that maybe Joseph Turner would reject it. And if he rejected it, she didn't know what she would do because she couldn't deal with his opposition. And if you read the early accounts of her experience, she describes how when the schedule was set up for her to be at her home and share her vision for the first time to a group of Adventists, that she ran to the other side of town. And as she went into the other house, she went upstairs, and Joseph Turner apparently had been at that house, and he comes down the stairs, and she's, oh, here he is. And he looks and he says, Sister Ellen, I didn't expect to see you here. And she says, I didn't answer him a word. And she goes upstairs. And Turner goes on to the meeting, and they don't hear about her vision. And so he comes by the house as he's on his way probably down to Massachusetts, down to Boston area, knocks on the door, and asks to hear Ellen Harmon's vision before he goes. And so she shares it with fear and trembling. And he says, praise the Lord. That's what I believe. And she's so relieved. Oh, praise the Lord. You know, I thought for sure he was going to oppose me, and if he opposed me, I wouldn't know what to do with it. He's an older man. Well, Turner comes back, and he comes up with this idea that maybe he could take her around and maybe even manage her a little bit. You see, Turner has been getting involved in a medical modality of that day called animal magnetism. You heard of that? more popularly known as mesmerism, named after the author of this theory. Heard of mesmerism? Franz Mesmer is also considered to be the father of modern hypnotism among those in the field of psychology and so forth. And so Franz Mesmer was quite a fellow. He believed that the problem was that there was this misalignment of magnetic energy in the universe that needed to be aligned. And when the person is ill, that energy is misaligned in their own person. And that a person who's healthy could realign a person. And so that hence led to the type of hypnotism. Of course, his focus was on producing a crisis. He wanted to bring a crisis. And so this hypnotic event was a way of inducing this. And Mesmer was very arrogant. He believed he could align the sun himself. Imagine aligning the energies of the sun. Obviously, this man was loony. He was loony in a rational way. We have a lot of rational loonies around, don't we? But Joseph Turner is interested in this. And he's not the only one. In America, there's an interest in mesmerism. There are volumes that are being published, and there are physicians of animal magnetism that were healing people. And Turner thought it was a great idea. And so he was trying to mesmerize or hypnotize other young girls in the community there in Portland. And he decided Ellen Harmon's visions might be something he could manage and take her around. But the Lord showed her in vision that she could not trust him and that she should not go with this man. But for a while, he's trying to get her to go along with him. Well, it's as she's gone to the western states. We say western states because from Maine it's west, right? To New Hampshire and Vermont, just over into Vermont. As she's coming back from there, she's hurt near Grantham. And she's thrown out of a buggy, and her side's hurt, and she's there in a home. And her sister Sarah's praying with her. And during the night, she's taken off in vision. And the Lord shows her the danger of fanaticism. Now you have to understand that before this, she's not really had a vision on this. She's dependent upon her own experience and interactions, circumstances. She's trying to share what the Lord's shown her. She's a young girl. But now she's shown in vision the danger of fanaticism. And particularly the danger of Joseph Turner's fanaticism and mesmerism. And the Lord instructs her in vision that she is to go back and to confront him. Now you can't imagine a more terrifying prospect for her than that. And so she doesn't know what to do, but she goes back to Portland. She gets back to Portland, and her parents' home is dark and cold. No one's there. Where are her parents? Turns out they've gone up to Poland, Maine, where her Robert and Eunice Harmon's daughters, two of them, lived. Mary and Carolyn, and they're staying with Mary. And the reason they're up there is because they didn't feel comfortable with what Joseph Turner was doing. And Turner had been telling everyone that Robert Harmon was lost because he was resisting and rejecting what he was doing. He said Eunice Harmon probably was lost. So they're up in Poland. And so Ellen Harmon goes over to Elizabeth Haynes' home. Remember, that's where she had her first vision, right? And she goes into the meeting. Joseph Turner is there. She doesn't have courage to say anything. But she's taken off in vision in the meeting. And Turner, who's still trying to kind of get control of her, as she's having her vision and saying what she's saying, you know, she would often walk gracefully or should speak while she was in vision. He was saying, listen, this is the Lord working. This is the Lord speaking. But then she kind of frowns and she begins to talk about Turner and what he's doing. and the danger of what he's doing. And he starts getting agitated. And now he starts looking around the room and he says, who's mesmerizing her? Who's taking control of her now? You know, as if he had done the first part and he's competing with someone. And everyone's kind of, huh? What? And she comes out of vision. You know, isn't it sweet that the Lord sometimes would put her in vision to help her to confront some things that she personally didn't know how she could do it? Isn't that sweet of the Lord? And you can imagine as she comes out of vision and she's aware of what's going on, the tension in the room. She's an introvert. Ellen Harmon is an introvert. You know this, don't you? By nature, she's an introvert. She was shy. And her first goal was to get out of the room. So she slips into the vestibule, or the entrance to the house. Often they'd have the parlor on one side and the kitchen, great room on the other, and you'd have the entryway, central fireplace, typical probably New England home, we don't know, but more than likely. And a lady meets her, and she had been listening during the vision, and she says, "Would you talk to my daughters?" They were upstairs. And she goes upstairs and she tells them not to have anything to do with Joseph Turner, and that it is not the Lord's leading. We're on page 4, number 1. I'm just kind of telling you the story. The outline gives you closer documented details here. But Ellen Harmon had a mission. God told her to go talk to Mrs. Turner. Mrs. Turner. She has a message for her, not for Joseph Turner at this point. She gets in a buggy, somehow goes over to the Turner home. I wish we knew what Mrs. Turner's name was. I've tried to figure out her first name just to make the story nice. You know, you can tell the name. Don't know Mrs. Turner's first name. And gets there. And as she gets out of the buggy, Mrs. Turner is coming out the front door. And Ellen Harmon's emotions kind of swell over and she just begins to cry. And Mrs. Turner's crying. And they embrace there in the front yard, hugging each other, crying. They must have had some relationship before. You know, it's interesting. You wonder how some of these things worked. And Ellen Harmon says, "Mrs. Turner, God has sent me to tell you something. The Lord has told me that you are not lost. You are not lost." You see, what had been happening is Joseph Turner had been in his own parlor trying to mesmerize young girls. Why is it always young girls? This man. Trying to mesmerize young girls until the wee hours of the morning. And Mrs. Turner thinks this isn't quite right. Smart woman, right? But his response had been, "You're not discerning the Spirit of the Lord, and you're lost. You've rejected the Spirit of God and His leading." And the worst part is she believed it. And so God sent Ellen Harmon to tell Mrs. Turner that the Lord had shown her that she was not lost. Wow. She ends up going up to Poland right after this, to where her parents are. Ellen Harmon does. Worn out. She was sick. You know, some of Ellen White's early sickness was, I think, in part due to the stress she was under, don't you think? I think there are some other issues we could discuss and reasons, but I think in this case, this was incredibly hard for her to do God's bidding. You know, if God can take, let's just be practical for just a moment. If God can take a 17-year-old girl who has health problems and use her, do you think He can use us? Amen. Even when we're under stress? You know, when you're out in that difficult pastorate in a few years, where you just don't know what you're going to do, just remember this. Remember this practically. That if God could see her through, He can see you through. Amen? So don't let that discourage you. And so her family is there praying for her. Now Turner, what's going on with him? He can't control this girl. She's uncontrollable. Dorinda Baker was seems to be pretty manageable. A lot of these other people, but Ellen Harmon just is not controllable. And she's up in Poland, his hometown. I got to get up there and see what she's up to. I got to deal with this problem. So he comes up to Poland. And across town, he's having a meeting at John McGuire's home, Captain John McGuire, who's an Adventist who has a home there. And Joseph Turner is having these meetings, and Ellen Harmon is back at home, her sister's home, Mary Foss. And she is given a vision. And in this vision, the Lord tells her that she is to go over and confront Turner again. And Ellen White confesses that she is just plain afraid of this man. And she tells the Lord this in vision. And from what she tells us of this account, the Lord promised her that He would send her as many angels as she needed to protect her in this meeting. That's pretty nice assurance, isn't it? You go, the Lord will send as many angels as you need. Yes?
I have a question related to each other. When you say visions, what do you exactly mean when you say second? Do you think that happened with her accident when she was younger, that perhaps she damaged some parts of the brain?
Temporal lobe epilepsy, that type of thing. That's another study which deserves an hour or two itself. I don't know if you cover temporal lobe epilepsy issues in this class. A few years ago, was interviewed by BBC on this issue, believe it or not, where they were trying to say that a lot of religious reveries, as they call them, or they didn't say reveries, they said supernatural-like or experiences were a result of temporal lobe epilepsy. But there have been several physicians who have looked at it, and they really don't match. There may be some distant related things, but they seem very different. I don't think that matches. But when I say visions, I'm talking about where she is not in control of herself. You know, a vision is God's true manifestation of guiding and communicating. Demon possession is Satan's counterfeit. Understand what I'm saying? She would usually be awake in her visions, but she was not aware of what was going on around her. Her reality was within her head, what God was showing her. But that did translate often into physical movements and speaking and, interacting that was not connected to what was happening exactly where she was, as far as she could tell. Because she was not aware of what was happening around her when she was in vision, in her immediate circumstance. So she decides she's going to go over, back to Poland, Maine. She decides that she's going to go over to John McGuire's home. And the whole family gets into this big buggy, maybe a buckboard or something, where they can all go. They're not going to let her go alone. They're going to support her. So the family goes, and they show up at John McGuire's home. And Turner has been telling them, boasting, that he understood. She wrote, on top of page 5, Joseph Turner was there. He had boasted that he understood the art of mesmerism, that he could mesmerize me, that he could prevent me from having a vision or telling a vision in his presence. In other words, he could stop it. And then she comes into the room. And I'm sure everyone's quite surprised. Turner as well. He didn't expect this young girl now to come confront him in meeting again. Now, we don't know just what was happening. Ellen Harmon's not up speaking. Maybe Turner isn't. I'm not even sure how it's happening. But Ellen Harmon, somehow this man is trying to establish contact with her psychologically. And he must have been sitting over to one side or something, and she's at another part of the room. I'm sure they're not by each other. And he apparently is giving her the look, that I don't even want to try to even think to pretend that. And he had his fingers up. And he's looking through his fingers, maybe just so she could see his eyes. And this is what she says. It's here, the quote on page 5. He had his eyes looking right out of his fingers. And his eyes looked like snake's eyes, evil. She says, I turned and looked right around, and I raised both hands, and it's left out, but she would have written, cried out, another angel, Lord, another angel. Remember the promise. And then she says, the Spirit and the power of God came upon me, and I was taken off in vision right there. Turner had no control whatever. And when the vision is over, she wrote that with strong confidence, rejoicing in God, we returned to my sisters. And of course, those who had been there asked Turner, well, why didn't you, I don't know if this is in my notes, maybe not, said, well, why didn't you stop her from having her vision? And the recollection was that his response was, well, you wanted to listen to her. Right. Trying to salvage a difficult situation that he doesn't have any control over. That's what he's doing. After this, Turner becomes Ellen Harmon's adversary. He follows her around, trying to destroy her and undermine her. When she goes down to Massachusetts, she has initial success down there in the fall of 1845. People are responding, and then he comes down with another man named John Howell, and he follows her around, trying to undermine her influence, trying to create doubts. And he's fairly successful. Becomes very difficult for her. And so this is Ellen Harmon here in 1844 with Joseph Turner. I think that this is one of the characteristics that helps me realize that God was working. I mean, what is it that causes her to stand up against this man and have such an independence? It's not her own personality. Oh, no. It's not her own talents and skill. Oh, no. I think there's really only one answer. Her visions themselves and God's help, don't you think? Something powerful there that's happening with Ellen White. Another type of fanaticism she has to deal with during this time is extreme sanctification, sometimes referred to as holy flesh fanaticism. Now, we've just mentioned spiritualizers, and I'll talk about them in a moment a little bit. But you have the spiritualizers who make everything spiritual. Then you have the extreme literalists, in a sense, who try to make themselves the standard. The origin of the idea really in the Millerite movement was a man named Starkweather, John Starkweather. And it's the idea that when you are converted by God, and He gives you the gift of sanctification, that your impulses become holy. Now that's true, sort of, right? I mean, it is true that Jesus changes our desires. Isn't that right? Amen? But Jesus doesn't take away our sinful nature until glorification, right? But the extreme sanctification people essentially said that He took away the sinful nature so that their impressions were holy. And whatever impressions. That's dangerous, right? There's some interesting stories of Starkweather. I won't take time, and it's not in my outline. There were some fanatics connected with him. There was one lady who thought that she could stop a train. Stand in the tracks and stop a train. Putting her hand up. If the Spirit of God put it upon her, she could do it. And so you have this type of an idea. Well, as would be expected, you have some fanatics. Probably the one who Ellen White interacts with most, or those that she interacts with most in this area, were up in Topsom, Maine. There was one man named William Hyde. He had been a bookseller, his son of a bookseller and publisher in Portland, Maine. William H. Hyde is actually a little bit younger than Ellen Harmon. And he is involved with these holy flesh people, these extreme sanctification believers. And they were advocating, and I'll put in quotes what Ellen White says about it, that they could show their love to one another in a familiar way without sin. Men and women could even lie on a bed together, unmarried, without any sinful or impure thoughts. Well, Ellen Harmon tried to, yes. Fanaticism is dedication and conviction that loses controls. It loses clear scriptural, biblical, and rational controls. You see, formalism is the disease of the insincere, or those who have become indifferent to faith, but are covering themselves with a guise of faith. Fanaticism is the disease of the sincere, those who are committed, those who are dedicated, but they lose the controls and they wipe out. And Satan, every time you have the moving of the Spirit of God, you're going to have fanaticism. And my first quote from Ellen White at the beginning of this outline, actually I didn't take time to read at the beginning. She says, "We have found," page 1, "in our experience that if Satan cannot keep souls bound in the ice of indifference, he will try to push them into the fire of fanaticism. When the Spirit of the Lord comes among his people, the enemy seizes his opportunity to work also upon different minds and lead them to mingle their own peculiar traits of character with the work of God. Thus there is always danger that they may allow their own spirit to mingle with the work, and that unwise moves may be made." She knew all about that, right? So, William Hyde, James White, Ellen Harmon, and others tried to convince him to leave these extreme sanctification fanatics, and he refused. He developed a case of severe dysentery, bloody dysentery, which is horrible. He was brought low to the point almost of death. Finally, he sent for James White, Ellen Harmon, and others who were trying to help him, and he told them to come and pray for him. They came and they says, "We will not pray for you here, but if you will let us take you away from here, we will pray for you." And he agreed. So they take him away from these fanatics, take him across town. The fanatics are following them, by the way, according to the account. It's interesting. Saying, come back, don't reject the Lord, come back, come back. But he stays with them. And they gather around William Hyde's bed, and they pray for him. And he's healed instantly. And he gets up and he eats a farmer's meal. This is before health reform. Pork and potatoes and whatever else. A serious farmer's meal. And he's not hurt. He's not affected. He's well. He says, I've been healed. And a little later, he's present when Ellen White has her New Earth vision. And he writes the first poem that becomes the first song of the movement that would become Sabbatarian Adventism. It's in our present hymnal. It's the hymn, "We Have Heard." We have heard of the bright, the holy land. And he was there at that vision when she has the New Earth vision a little bit later. But he rejects this extreme sanctification view. And so Ellen Harmon is involved in trying to help these type of people as well. I think because of time, I'm going to go right on to the Spiritualizer. So let's look at page 8. We'll just take a few moments. I've already told you a bit about the Spiritualizers. Orlando Squires and his Voice of the Shepherd in Utica, New York, become the standard for this view. It comes out with a number of issues where it denies anything literal and says that everything is spiritually fulfilled. At one point, they were even saying that Jesus was not a literal person. He was a spiritual influence and didn't have a real person to him. Ellen White also confronts that. She's very clear in Spiritual Gifts. She's down in Massachusetts saying, no, I've seen Jesus. He's a real person. And her vision, her New Earth vision, is a very literal vision. And it confronts these Spiritualizers. And her first three major visions, you know what they are, right? The Midnight Cry vision, December 1844, confirms the 1844 experience. Her February 1845 vision, the Bridegroom Vision, where she begins to see something about the heavenly sanctuary and Jesus' work there. And then the third major vision is the New Earth vision, which is probably around May 1845. Again, we don't know the exact dates. And she tends to put those two together in one of the broadsides we'll look at. But if you read Spiritual Gifts, they're separate visions, separated by about half a year. And so she has this vision in the midst of this spiritualizing fanaticism. And look at some of the descriptions here on page 8 on the bottom. She's envisioned, she says, with Jesus at our head. She's in the new earth. She goes forward in time. You know, some critics have said she believed in spiritualism because she saw these Fitch and Stockman in this vision who had died. And that if we really believe that people are unconscious, then she wouldn't have seen them. But what they miss is that God isn't controlled by time. And he took her forward in time and showed her the new earth. Can God do such things? He's a God of time too, isn't he? I don't understand it all. So he takes her to the future when they would be resurrected. And so she's walking in the new earth. With Jesus at our head, we descended from the city down to this earth on a great mighty mountain. Then we began to look at the glorious things outside the city. There I saw most beautiful houses that had the appearance of silver, supported by 4 pillars set with pearls. I saw another field full of all kinds of flowers, and as I plucked them, I cried out, they will never fade. Next I saw a field of tall grass, most glorious to behold. It was living green. Imagine living green. And had a reflection of silver and gold as it waved to the glory of King Jesus. And she goes on and describes it. And finally they get to the table, the great banquet table. And she says, we can see clear across it. And she has so forgotten that she's in vision that she sets down to eat. And Jesus says, you can't. You have to go back and tell them what you've seen. And so she comes out of vision. She says, I've seen the better land. It's ruined this one for me. It's not spiritual. It's real. Amen? It's literal. So she's confronting these various fanaticisms. And of course, there's lots of other extreme types of fanaticism that defy categorization, such as extreme humility, where people believed they had to become as little children, and so they'd crawl around on the ground. Up in South Paris, Maine, the Stevens family were particularly afflicted by this. One guy was crawling in front of a buggy, and the buggy driver got so mad he started plying his whip to him. They put him in insane asylums and things like this. So you had this type of fanaticism. There's another type who believed you should only eat sugar. It's probably kind of nice, I guess, but you get old after a while. And so forth and so on. These were imbalanced people. So Ellen Harmon is confronting each one of these fanatical ideas in different ways in her ministry. I think more than anything else, this helps me to think, you know, God is working here. How is she charting this course through here if God is not helping her? Sure, later she's challenged as being a fanatic herself. She's associating with them, yes. But these are the people who still believe something happened in 1844. This is the crowd that God's trying to help and work with in particular at this point. So we shouldn't be too hard on her because of that. And I think that God is leading. Quick summary. One of the key elements that differentiate her from several other female prophetic claimants was her independence of thought and action. Though only 17, she even confronted the more powerful and influenced Adventist minister in Maine, most powerful, Joseph Turner. She stood apart from those who were experiencing various phases of fanaticism that was ravaging Bridegroom Adventists. Mesmerism, extreme sanctification, spiritualizing, extreme literalizing, and other bizarre manifestations. And, well, I think God did this because he was trying to help that little flock get through this time until the light could begin to shine and the movement could really begin. I say thank God for this gift, don't you?